Dawn broke over the French coastline on June 6, 1944. Inside a fortified bunker, 20-year-old Hinrich Seau gripped his weapon and stared at the horizon. He had never killed anyone before. Within hours, everything would change. Seau was a farm boy from Lower Saxony. 3 months earlier, he'd been assigned to Ardennes 62, a concrete fortress overlooking what Allied planners called Omaha Beach. He'd spent those months digging trenches, stringing wire, and positioning the machine guns that now pointed toward the English Channel. Every inch of sand below was mapped in his mind. He knew where the tide rose, where rocks broke through, where attacking soldiers would be forced into narrow passages, the kill zones his officers had meticulously planned. Through the mist, ships materialized. Hundreds at first, then thousands. Seau had been told the Atlantic Wall couldn't be breached. He'd been told Americans were undisciplined, soft, unprepared for real combat. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Fraking, had emphasized the night before that the invasion must be stopped on the beach itself. Field Marshal Rommel had declared the first 24 hours would determine the war's outcome. If the enemy established a foothold, Germany would lose. Nothing prepared Seau for what followed. What unfolded that morning, what Seau would struggle to comprehend for the rest of his life, marked the beginning of a profound shift in how German soldiers perceived their American adversaries. A shift from contempt to confusion, from confusion to grudging respect, and from respect to something resembling fear. This isn't simply a story about battles. It's about perception, how an entire army of professional soldiers was forced to reconsider everything they believed about the men they fought. And it begins not on Normandy's beaches, but in North Africa's sun-baked deserts 18 months prior. February 1943. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps had every reason for confidence. These were veterans who'd spent 2 years fighting the British across Libya and Egypt under Erwin Rommel's command. They knew how to win. These men had survived the crucible of desert warfare. They'd fought through sandstorms that reduced visibility to zero. They'd mastered tank combat across vast open terrain where one tactical error meant death. They'd faced British Commonwealth forces at Tobruk and Alamein. They'd pushed to within 60 miles of the Suez Canal. They considered themselves, with considerable justification, among the world's finest soldiers. When word arrived that American troops had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch in November 1942, German reactions ranged from amusement to open contempt. A lance corporal from the 15th Panzer Division wrote home in mid-February 1943 with a typical assessment. "We fought the Amos a few days ago, using German slang for Americans, and destroyed over 90 of their tanks. We will blow them and all their rabble to perdition." This wasn't mere arrogance born of victory. It was rooted in deeply held beliefs about American society itself. German propaganda had spent years portraying the United States as a decadent nation, obsessed with money, weakened by racial mixing, incapable of producing real soldiers. The prevailing Wehrmacht view held that Americans were amateurs playing at war, while German professionals did the real fighting. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm every German belief. Rommel's forces tore through inexperienced American units, inflicting over 6,000 casualties, approximately 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 captured. American tanks burned in the Tunisian hills. American infantry fled in disorder. American commanders lost control of their units. The problems were real and numerous. Units were scattered across wide frontages without proper coordination. Communications broke down repeatedly. Some replacements had arrived at the front only days before the battle, many never having completed basic training. One regiment received its first shipment of bazookas on February 12th and had to learn how to use them against actual German armor 2 days later. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American II Corps, had positioned his forces in ways that invited disaster. Units were dispersed across a 30-mile front. Task forces were fragmented and unable to support one another. When the German attack came, American formations were defeated piecemeal. German tank crews spoke of the Tunisian fighting with something approaching joy. After years of facing the methodical, well-supplied British, they found American units disorganized and easily panicked. Panzers rolled through American positions that should have held. Infantry scattered before German pressure. Officers lost contact with their men. Rommel himself initially shared his troops' dismissive view. He'd studied the American positions, noted the scattered deployment of their forces, and identified what he called fundamental weaknesses in their tactical thinking. The Americans, he believed, were years away from becoming competent soldiers. But something happened during those 5 days at Kasserine that Rommel didn't expect. Something that planted the first seed of doubt in German minds about their assessment of American fighting capability. On the 4th day of battle, American resistance stiffened. Artillery fire, which had been sporadic and poorly coordinated at the start, suddenly became devastatingly accurate. Infantry units that had broken under the initial assault reformed and counterattacked. The withdrawal Rommel had expected to become a rout instead became an organized fighting retreat. By February 22nd, Rommel made a decision that surprised his own staff. He ordered a withdrawal, not because he'd been defeated, but because the Americans were no longer behaving like the beaten enemy he'd anticipated. In his personal papers, Rommel later recorded his revised assessment. The tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance. That phrase, recovered very quickly, would become a recurring theme in German assessments of American forces for the rest of the war. The Germans had expected the Americans to break. Instead, they bent and bounced back. What Rommel and his officers couldn't see was the machinery of change already grinding into motion behind American lines. Within weeks of Kasserine, heads began to roll. General Fredendall was relieved of command and replaced by George S. Patton, a vastly different kind of leader. Omar Bradley came in as Assistant Corps Commander. The entire command structure was reorganized. More importantly, the American Army learned. Officers who'd witnessed the debacle analyzed what had gone wrong and implemented corrections. Units that had been scattered were consolidated. Training programs were intensified. Communication procedures were overhauled. Artillery coordination, which had been sporadic at best, became a priority. The speed of this adaptation shocked German commanders, who expected the Americans to require months or years to digest their lessons. Instead, improvements were visible within weeks. At the Battle of El Getter in late March 1943, just 5 weeks after Kasserine, American forces faced another German attack. This time, they held. American artillery shattered German armor columns. Infantry stood its ground. The Germans withdrew, having accomplished nothing. This pattern of rapid learning would define the American military experience in World War II. Unlike armies built on long traditions and rigid doctrines, the Americans proved willing to throw out methods that didn't work and adopt new ones that did. They learned from the British. They learned from the Germans. Most importantly, they learned from their own mistakes. And they learned fast. The German army in Tunisia was eventually trapped between American forces advancing from the west and British forces pressing from the east. On May 13, 1943, the remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendered along with over 260,000 Axis troops. It was a catastrophe for Germany, second only to Stalingrad. Among those captured were many of the veterans who had mocked American soldiers just 3 months earlier. But the full implications of what this meant wouldn't become clear until the summer of 1944, until Normandy, until men like Hinrich Seau saw with their own eyes what American industrial power and American determination could actually accomplish. The morning of June 6, 1944 changed everything German soldiers thought they knew about fighting Americans. So was positioned in Widerstandsnest 62, a fortified resistance nest overlooking what the Allies had designated as Omaha Beach. He manned an MG-42 machine gun with a clear field of fire across several hundred meters of open sand. Below him, the first waves of American infantry would have to cross that killing ground under his guns. When the landing craft appeared through the morning fog, Seau began firing. He didn't stop for hours. The weapon in his hands was an MG-42, one of the most effective machine guns of the war. It fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar. Below him, American soldiers had to cross several hundred meters of open sand while exposed to this fire. There was no cover, no concealment, just sand and water and the slow dying of men who had nowhere to hide. So later estimated he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. He went through several barrels as they overheated. He fired until his hands were blistered and his ears rang and the smell of burnt propellant filled the bunker. He fired until he ran out of machine gun ammunition and switched to a rifle. He fired until the Americans finally broke through the defenses and he was forced to withdraw. What happened on that beach has been described in countless histories, but the German perspective reveals something different from the American accounts of heroism and sacrifice. From behind his machine gun, Seau watched wave after wave of American soldiers fall. He watched them pile up at the waterline. He watched the tide come in and move the bodies. And he watched something else. He watched them keep coming. This was the detail that German soldiers across Normandy reported with a mixture of disbelief and horror. The Americans did not stop. Landing craft were destroyed and more appeared. Men were cut down on the sand and more ran forward to take their places. Entire units were annihilated and fresh units landed to continue the assault. A German wireless operator assigned to a bunker near Seau's position later described what he experienced that morning. On that night of June 6th, none of us expected the invasion anymore. There was a strong wind, thick cloud cover. But then in the night, the air was full of innumerable planes. We thought, what are they demolishing tonight? But then it started. One message followed the other. Parachutists landing here, gliders landing there. Finally, landing craft approaching. In the morning, a huge naval force was sighted. That was the last report the advanced observation posts could send before they were overwhelmed. Wireless communications were jammed, cables cut. Officers lost grasp of the situation entirely. When this soldier was eventually captured and saw the scale of what the Allies had assembled, his reaction summarized what many Germans felt. At first I was rather depressed, of course. I, an old soldier, a prisoner of war after a few hours of the invasion. But when I saw the material behind the enemy front, I could only say, "Old man, how lucky you have been." A German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, defending the sector next to Seau's position later, described the psychological impact. We had been told the Americans were poor soldiers. We were told they would not fight. But they came across that beach into our guns. They kept coming. We killed them, and still they came. No soldier who experienced this could maintain contempt for such an enemy. The physical scale of the invasion compounded the psychological shock. German defenders looked out at the English Channel and saw an armada that defied comprehension. One captured German soldier marched past supply dumps that had been established on the beach within hours of the landing, reportedly made an observation that became famous among logistics officers. "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He was more right than he knew. The war in Europe was what the Germans called a Materialschlacht, a battle of material. And the Americans fought this battle on a scale the Germans could barely imagine. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, more than 130,000 troops had come ashore. Within a week, over 300,000. The Allies had constructed artificial harbors out of prefabricated components shipped across the Channel. They had created a port where no port existed. German officers who had studied the impossibility of supplying an invasion force across open beaches now watched the impossible happening in front of them. These artificial harbors, codenamed mulberries, were engineering marvels. The Allies had sunk old ships to create breakwaters. They had floated massive concrete caissons across the Channel. They had assembled pontoon bridges and piers that could rise and fall with the tides. A new port appeared on the French coast over the space of days. German officers who had fought from France to North Africa to Russia, who had heard of the logistical impossibilities that had doomed Operation Sea Lion, looked at this and understood they were fighting something unprecedented. The comparison with German logistics was stark. The Wehrmacht was still heavily dependent on horses for transport. Their motor pool was a cobbled-together mess of German, Italian, captured French, and captured British vehicles, each requiring different spare parts that were chronically unavailable. German soldiers often went hungry, while the Americans seemed to have unlimited food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. Capturing an American supply depot was like finding a gold mine. German soldiers who captured American positions were astonished by the abundance. Everything a fighting man needed was organized and waiting. Rations that included chocolate and cigarettes, medical supplies, spare parts, fuel. The contrast with German deprivation was demoralizing. The German experience at Normandy forced a fundamental reassessment of American military capability. But it wasn't just the material that impressed German soldiers. It was how the Americans fought once they got off those beaches. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, American infantry tactics evolved with a speed that alarmed German commanders. Units that had performed poorly in the initial days adapted their methods within weeks. They developed new techniques for clearing the dense bocage. They integrated tanks, infantry, and engineers into combined arms teams. They learned to call in devastating artillery and air support with remarkable coordination. The bocage was terrain ideally suited for defense. Ancient hedgerows, centuries old, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small fields. Each hedgerow sat atop an earth embankment thick enough to stop a tank. The vegetation was dense enough to hide machine gun positions. Every field was a potential killing ground. German forces used the bocage terrain expertly. They had dug in, established interlocking fields of fire, and prepared to bleed the Americans for every meter of ground. In the early days after the landings, this strategy worked. American units took heavy casualties trying to push through the hedgerows using tactics designed for more open terrain. But then the Americans adapted. Someone, the exact origin is disputed, came up with the idea of welding steel teeth onto the front of Sherman tanks. These teeth, fashioned from German beach obstacles, allowed tanks to cut through the hedgerow embankments rather than climbing over them, which had exposed their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons. Within weeks, thousands of American tanks had been modified. Infantry tactics evolved alongside the equipment. Small unit leaders developed techniques for coordinated assaults on hedgerow positions. Artillery forward observers perfected methods for calling in accurate fire on concealed German positions. Engineers blasted gaps for armor. Air support learned to work closer to friendly troops without causing friendly casualties. The Germans watched this evolution with alarm. They were accustomed to fighting enemies who took months to adjust their methods. The British, in particular, had been slow to change. The Americans changed in days. Ideas flowed up from privates and sergeants to colonels and generals. Solutions that worked were immediately shared across units. The entire army seemed to learn as a single organism. Field Marshal Rommel, now commanding the defense of Normandy, noted this adaptation with concern. In a report to Berlin, he wrote, "The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition." The American artillery system was unlike anything the Germans had faced. It wasn't just the number of guns, though those numbers were formidable. It was the sophistication of how those guns were employed. American fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously on a single target in what was called time-on-target missions. All the shells arrived at the same moment, giving enemy soldiers no warning to take cover. German veterans spoke of American artillery with something approaching reverence. The accuracy was stunning. The volume was overwhelming, and it seemed to arrive everywhere, all the time, without end. One German officer described lying in a trench while American shells fell for hours, unable to move, unable to fight back, just waiting for the barrage to end or for a shell to find him. The small Piper Cub observation planes that American artillery battalions used became symbols of impending doom. German soldiers learned that if they could see one of those little aircraft circling overhead, their position had been spotted and artillery fire was imminent. The Germans called them their most hated enemies, more feared than tanks or infantry. By December 1944, German forces in the West had been pushed back to their own borders. Hitler, desperate to reverse the tide, gathered his remaining reserves for one final offensive. Operation Walk dem Rhein would strike through the Ardennes forest, the same route German forces had used to defeat France in 1940. The goal was to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. And it would provide the final proof of how completely German perceptions of American soldiers had changed. The offensive was Hitler's personal gamble. Against the advice of his generals, he had gathered virtually every reserve the Wehrmacht could scrape together. 3 armies, over 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks. German commanders were skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model both believed the plan was too ambitious given the resources available. Model reportedly told subordinates the plan had no more than a 10% chance of success. But Hitler would hear no objections. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops, with nearly 1,000 tanks, launched a surprise attack against American positions thinly spread across 85 miles of the Ardennes. The timing was deliberate. Hitler had waited for weather conditions that would ground Allied aircraft. Heavy fog and snow blanketed the region, neutralizing the air superiority that had devastated German forces in Normandy. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many of them inexperienced or exhausted from previous fighting, were overwhelmed. In some sectors, German forces advanced 50 miles in the first few days. For a moment, it seemed the old German assessment might be vindicated. American units broke. Thousands surrendered. The most inexperienced division, the 106th Infantry, lost 2 entire regiments, over 7,000 men, in one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. But then something happened. Something that crystallized everything German soldiers had learned about their enemy over the previous 2 years. American forces at the crossroads town of Bastogne refused to retreat. Surrounded by German forces demanding their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. That single word communicated something the Germans had come to understand through bitter experience. The Americans would not break. They would not quit. They could be killed, but they could not be made to stop fighting. The defense of Bastogne became legendary. The town sat at the junction of 7 roads, making it essential for German logistics. Without Bastogne, the German offensive couldn't be sustained. Inside the perimeter, conditions were desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed to Bastogne, was low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The weather was brutal, temperatures well below freezing, snow falling constantly. German forces surrounded the town completely. Yet the defenders held. On December 26th, elements of General George Patton's 3rd Army broke through to Bastogne. The relief force had traveled over 150 miles in winter conditions, fighting through German resistance the entire way. This movement, executed in just days, was considered one of the most remarkable achievements of American logistics and leadership in the entire war. When the weather cleared on December 23rd, American air power entered the battle. The impact was devastating. German tanks, trucks, and troops that had been moving freely under cloud cover were suddenly exposed to relentless attack. The offensive, which depended on speed and momentum, ground to a halt. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. German losses exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, or missing. More importantly, the Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves. There would be no more offensives, no more counterattacks. Only retreat. The human cost was staggering on both sides. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including over 19,000 killed. But while American losses could be replaced, German losses could not. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. German soldiers who survived it came away with a different kind of assessment. They had seen an army that could absorb a devastating surprise attack, stabilize its lines, and counterattack with overwhelming force, all within the span of a few weeks. By spring 1945, German soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Over 317,000 were captured in the Ruhr pocket alone, twice what American intelligence had estimated. Many actively sought out American units to surrender to, preferring American captivity to falling into Soviet hands. German soldiers made their decisions based on what they had learned about their enemy. Word had spread through the Wehrmacht that Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. They provided food and medical care. They did not execute surrendering soldiers. In 2017, a German man named Günter Grass, then 91 years old, rode an electric bicycle onto Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. He had made this journey to say thank you. Grass had been captured in Normandy in August 1944, wounded by a grenade at age 18. What he experienced there defied everything he'd been told about Americans. Instead of brutality, he found ice cream and Coca-Cola. Hinrich Seau, the machine gunner from Omaha Beach, survived the war. He returned to farming in Lower Saxony and tried to forget what he had done on June 6, 1944. But the memories wouldn't leave him. In 1963, Seau returned to Normandy for the first time. He visited the American cemetery overlooking the beach, where he had fired his machine gun. He walked among the white crosses marking the graves of men he may have killed. And he wept. The transformation in how German soldiers viewed American troops between 1943 and 1945 was profound and complete. At Kasserine Pass, German veterans expected a quick victory against soft amateurs. By the end of the Bulge, they had learned that American forces could absorb catastrophic setbacks and emerge stronger. The lesson that emerges from the German experience of American soldiers in World War II is clear. Perceptions formed in ignorance can persist only until they collide with reality. And when that collision occurs, the awakening is often brutal, final, and irreversible.